um, participants. All right, everybody, welcome to this week's Corn Belt Umpires Association Zoom Lunch Clinic. My name is Jake Samp. I am joined by both Connor Singheisen and Jason Vaith. So the last couple weeks, we have gone over and done a bunch of different topics as far as, getting ready for preseason. And last week we talked about effective rule study. This week, we're going to dive into the rules a little bit more. As we have kind of talked about in a couple other clinics, this year is the first year that the SDUA is going to purchase NFHS rulebooks as opposed to the official baseball rulebook. The reason for that is most baseball in South Dakota is now played under official baseball rules. Also, we have a fair number of umpires in our association that work in Iowa, which is strictly NFHS. And so the way that it was discussed at the meeting last year was simply we're going to flip how we teach. So we're going to teach high school rules. And then when people get to the amateur level and to the Legion level, then we will teach them the modifications for official baseball rules. That being said, in almost every tournament that someone would work in, the NFHS DH rule would apply. So there are really three different types of the designated hitter, I didn't say three types, three options that a team has for the designated hitter. And we're going to focus on the high school rules here. I will tell you that a lot of this, for the guys that work college baseball that are newer to college, a lot of this stuff is going to sound the same, but there are a couple small differences. So and if you want to talk about the differences, I will talk about that after clinic. If you have seen this PowerPoint before, that's awesome. This PowerPoint was actually put together by our old friend Larry Gallagher, who unfortunately is no longer with us. But Larry did a fantastic job explaining the designated hitter. And so we're going to use Larry's PowerPoint today. So first and foremost, the first option we have is the straight nine. Some people consider the straight nine lineup to be National League batting lineup. That is, you have position players 1 through 9 that are on your lineup, and they're batting. So the pitcher is batting. They cannot later on in the game decide that we're going to use a designated hitter. That's not permitted under the rules. And Larry has a fantastic point on here, and one that we discussed last year when we talked about pregame routines, pregame mechanics, and just the mechanics of pregame was when you get your lineup card. If I'm working a game and Connor and Jason are my coaches, and Connor hands me a lineup card, I'm gonna say, Connor, so and so is your catcher. Yep. So and so is your pitcher. Yep. And confirming that you have straight nine. Yes. It's always good to verify what you have. That way, later on in the game, the coach can't come back and say, well, no, I had a designated hitter. It was, Baker. Well, no, coach, at the plate meeting, I asked you if you were batting with a straight nine, and you explained that you were. So no, by rule, you cannot add Baker in as your DH. The straight nine, I feel like, is the most straightforward of the lineup options. But does anybody have any questions on the straight nine? So we'll talk now about the traditional designated hitter. Some people refer to the traditional designated hitter as the American League lineup. Um, so like with a straight nine, you have to declare if you're using this designated hitter rule at the start of the game. And in high school, unlike with official baseball rules, and this is why most tournaments, even if you're using official baseball rules, will still utilize the NFHS designated hitter rule, is because it's not just the pitcher. In OBR, it's restricted to the pitcher, but high school, it's any player. So there are coaches that are notorious for designating a hitter for their left fielder. And if they utilize the traditional designated hitter, they effectively have a 10-player lineup, and each of the players can be re-entered. So you can re-enter the designated hitter as a hitter if you pinch hit for them. And that's kind of what that last bullet point that Larry had on there was. You can substitute for your DH, and you can substitute for player that is being DH'd for. Any questions before we dive deeper into the traditional designated hitter rule? So the designated hitter is locked in. Basically, you can't go and move your designated hitter around in the lineup. They have to be, if Baker is your designated hitter in 7 spot, you can't all of a sudden go and say that Smith in the 3rd spot is now your designated hitter. And then under NFHS rules, if the defensive player enters the game as a hitter, pinch hitting or pinch running for the designated hitter, then the DH would terminate. Or if the designated hitter, the player that is designated as the designated hitter, enters the game as a defensive player, then we would terminate under the traditional designated hitter rule. I think this is my last. Oh, no. Okay. So can the traditional designated hitter have a substitute? I'm not going to read off the slide here. The simple answer is yes, and they can be re-entered. But the last sentence here, it cannot alter the batting order. That's what I was talking about. So you have Baker in the 7th spot, Smith in the 3rd spot, and Baker's the designated hitter. Smith cannot become the designated hitter. Under the traditional designated hitter rule, can the traditional designated hitter take up a defensive position while remaining the designated hitter? And no. That is going to be contrasted by the player DH rule, and we'll talk about that here in a couple minutes. But under the traditional designated hitter rule, if they take up a position if they take up a defensive position, then they are no longer the designated hitter. And so this is, again, one of those things where it's really important from a mechanic standpoint that at the plate meeting, we find out what designated hitter or what lineup each team is using.
Jake, this may be covered in a following slide, but does the NFHS allow the double switch? Or are those two locked together?
No, I believe you can do the double switch. in NFHS. It's just more complicated than OBR or NCAA. I'll be honest, I don't think I've ever had a coach even try to do a double switch in 10 years of work in high school baseball. They've always been really nice and kept it simple. Here's your answer. I think this is your double switch question here, Connor. So what this question is asking is the fielding player the coach wants the fielding player to go hit in another spot. That is impermissible. If the coach wants the fielding player to hit, he has to bat in the designated hitter's position, and then the designated hitter is terminated for the rest of that game.
So we do not allow the double switch in high school. That's what that slide is saying.
Correct.
Cool. Awesome. Couldn't remember. Just wanted to make sure. Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? I think we got a couple other hypotheticals here. And on a side note, typically we do not publish the slide deck that we use for our clinics. I have already emailed our web guy. This will go up on the Corn Belt Umpires website, www.cornbeltumps.org. I know this is a lot of information, and obviously we're recording this on YouTube as well. So if you have questions, want to refer back to it, we'll have it here. If you're registered in Minnesota, I know it's on the central hub for Arbiter in Minnesota. And so we'll make sure that if you want it, we'll get it to you. So the simple way of breaking this one down is on a reentry, the designated hitter under the traditional designated hitter rule may reenter. But they don't come in as a designated hitter. They're now just a sub. Okay, there's two questions here on this slide. The top one is, I really feel doesn't need too much explanation.
Jake,
once
I'm gonna go back a slide, Jake.
Yeah, I got you.
So if we have a traditional DH and I don't feel like this is correct. Hang on.
Still there, Connor?
Sorry, I got screwed, baby. Hang on a second.
Oh.
So if we substitute, so Jake's the starting designated hitter. We remove Jake from the game, and we pinch hit for Jake. That doesn't terminate the DH. That just makes a substitute for the DH because our pitcher's still in place or our player is still in place. So if Jake goes back into the game, he should assume the designated hitter role because that position is still in play because that position has not gone to the field.
Correct. I think the way that I read Larry's explanation on this is it's a substitution because of the reentry, and so it's not like we're terminating reentry of the designated hitter. Anything else we do to the designated hitter will terminate the designated hitter.
No. So
I guess you can sub it. You can sub the designated hit. You can sub out myself.
Yes. So what this slide is demonstrating or should be demonstrating is that if Jake is a designated hitter, I pinch hit for Jake in the third inning. I strike out. they say, well, Connor, that didn't work. We're going to put Jake back in the designated hitter role. So then I am done for the game, and Jake can be pulled one more time, but if he's pulled again, he's done for the game. He's no longer an eligible substitute.
Correct.
Yeah. I'm not sure if it was fuzzy for anyone else, but it was pretty fuzzy for me, so I wanted to make sure we get that clarified before we move on.
Yep, absolutely. So, as we've kind of alluded to a couple times here, once you elect a lineup, you are bound by that lineup for that game. So you can't switch to a traditional, or sorry, you cannot switch from a traditional to a player DH, but you can go from a designated hitter to a straight 9. That would just simply be where the designated hitters terminated, because they take up a position in the field, or a couple of the other things that we talked about earlier as far as termination goes. This next question here is something that I really want to stress and emphasize, because it's something that I see routinely misunderstood. South Dakota, Iowa, and Minnesota, they allow courtesy runners for games. I'm not sure of the technicalities in Minnesota, but in South Dakota, we have pretty wide scope for courtesy runner rule. The problem that I see most umpires running into is you have Baker is your designated hitter, and he is the designated hitter for Smith, who is the catcher. Baker gets on base, and now they want to courtesy run for Baker. That is impermissible, because, and as we're going to talk about in the player DH rule, you have 2 separate lineups. And so the only time that you can courtesy run for a pitcher or a catcher is when the 2 lineups mesh. Because Smith, as the catcher who is being designated hit for, is not an offensive player. Therefore, he's not eligible to be courtesy run for. So you cannot courtesy run for the designated hitter. Okay. The player DH. As time has gone on, I have really come to embrace the player DH. When they first announced back in 2020, before the world as we knew it ended, had a couple coaches reach out to me and they go, "What do you think of the new rule?" And I said, "I hate it." And I had even joked with a coach. I said, he's like, "What do you think about it?" And I said, if you bring this to the plate meeting with me, I'm telling you to turn around and go get me a different lineup card. Simply because the way it was rolled out was done in a very confusing way. So we are kind of combining designated hitter rules, and it gets a little complicated when you start to terminate stuff. But the general approach is you're going to have 2 completely separate lineups. You have a defensive lineup and you have an offensive lineup. And the player DH can be for any one of the 9 starting players. And you can substitute for your player DH on defense, and they remain in their role in the offense as the designated hitter. And then it converts more to a traditional designated hitter rule, unless they are legally re-entered. So the rationale for the player DH rule as it was written by the NFHS was to allow a pitcher to stay in the game as a hitter, even though they may have exceeded their pitch count as the pitcher. Connor, am I missing anything on the fundamentals here that you can think of?
I got something for you, Jake. This is Jay Roofs.
Hey, what's up?
Basically, it's two different positions. He's defensively, he's a pitcher. Offensively, he's a DH. You cannot courtesy run for the DH. And I love the rule. I think it's a great idea.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the more I've used it and whatnot, gotten used to it, it's a great it's a great rule that the NFHS put in. And yeah, it's getting more kids playing time, and that's a great part of that rule too. And we're taking care of players. So yeah, the golden thread for me that made it all make sense was you have two different lineups. So you can't, you affect, like, you don't have a designated hitter when you're on defense. It's only when you're batting that you have the designated hitter. And so you don't have to necessarily focus on the defense initially. So, as I was just kind of saying, it does not have to be the pitcher. It can be any player. So I guess that's pretty straightforward. And it's very much like the traditional designated hitter rule in that sense. So can someone substitute? So what this question is asking is, if you enter them as both the player DH, can you still make a new player DH? And the answer is no. The substitute is only allowed to enter on defensive side of the lineup. If they don't, if they enter the game offensively, then the role of the DH would be terminated. This is the substitute, not the player DH. This is pretty straightforward as well. So Smith is the player DH, and he is playing pitcher. I feel like pitcher's kind of where you're going to run into this situation the most. And it's just like the traditional designated hitter, because it's the defensive substitution, which is legal. So Smith can pitch, go 3 innings, get pulled. He's still eligible to bat in the other innings. And then, whoever Smith's replacement is at pitcher, they pitch their inning or two and then they're replaced. And then after that substitution, Smith is still the designated hitter. Again, if the player DH is substituted for offensively, the player DH is terminated. So this question is asking whether we have a defensive substitution of the player DH, and that player DH re-enters the game as a substitute. So the player DH is removed, and we'll say the player DH is the second baseman. So the second baseman is removed, in the 3rd inning, and in the 6th inning, he is re-entered. Does that affect, or does that, I guess I'll ask it as the question, right? Does that count as the re-entry for the purpose of the re-entry rule? And the answer is yes. Because remember, if we do anything offensively, we're terminating the player DH. So defensively, this is the re-entry that would not destroy the player DH. Any questions on that? I feel like now we're really getting into the weeds of this rule.
I think I kind of understand this, Jake, but say the pitcher is the DH because that's the most common. He pitches his 3 innings. Somebody else comes in to pitch and he's DHing. Then later in the game, they want this DH that started out as the DH pitcher to play shortstop. He could go play shortstop as long as he bats in his DH spot, and then the DH would be terminated.
Okay, I want to make sure. Yep, I want to make sure I have your question correct. Okay, so we have a pitcher. The pitcher is removed from the game, and the new pitcher is a substitute from the bench.
Yes.
Okay, so then we have the shortstop, because you said the shortstop was removed. So then the shortstop comes from the shortstop position to the pitcher's mound to become the pitcher.
No, could the DH go in after he's done pitching and he's DHing? Let's say like 2 innings later, the coach wants to put him in as a defensive position, so he puts him in as shortstop, still batting in his original DH spot. Could the DH later in the game go into a defensive spot?
Yes, but it's so. If we're saying that that he enters for the shortstop or some other player already who has already taken up a defensive position has to become the pitcher. It can't be a sub from the bench.
Okay. Yep.
And you could also do another switch here where so the pitcher I guess this might be the easiest way to explain this. So Smith is your player DH and pitching. Smith gets done pitching. Baker is substituted for Smith as the pitcher. Smith remains as the player DH. Abel is the shortstop. So Baker is removed as the pitcher. Abel goes to the pitcher's mound. Smith may enter the game at shortstop legally.
Okay, and then the DH would be done because the DH would be playing.
The DH is not done because nothing has happened offensively to affect the DH.
Okay, since it's the same player, that makes sense.
But we have to be careful in how we do this because you could run into a situation where you're bringing in more players from the bench and you're not pulling the right players, and then we have a real mess. We got to be really careful and make sure we have it right. And the player DH, it's not a simple rule. I will tell you that when I was first really getting comfortable with the player DH rule, I absolutely carried a cheat sheet with me. It's a complicated rule and how it terminates. But if we affect anything on the offensive side, we're terminating the player DH. Connor, you got anything else to add on that?
No, I still carry a cheat sheet for DH at every level I work because it's so complicated. And there's so many options and things you can't do and things you can do, and nobody understands it. So it's nice to be able to pull something out of my pocket when a coach questions why they can do something and be like, this is why. This is where the rule's found. This is what it is. So this is legal or this is illegal if that's the case. But it's something that, like, no matter how many times it happens, you still question it on the legality of it because it's so complicated. So put a cheat sheet together that makes sense to you and terminology that you understand, and have some rule references on there to back it up, and you'll be golden.
Jay, what's up?
2 years ago at our South Dakota Umpires Association, that mandatory meeting that you got to go to,
Mhm.
Jesse handed out those laminated DH rules, and I carry that with me. Is there any way we can talk to him and maybe get more of those? I think those, I mean, obviously Connor got one, you got one, and I think those are the cheat sheets that you're using right in your book. But maybe we should reach out to him, find out where he got those from.
Give me 1 sec here. New share.
Because I use it
This
all
one?
the time too.
Oh, hang on. Resume share. There we go. This one? I think he just did this and he cut this part out right here.
Yeah, that looks right. I have mine with me right now.
Jay,
Oh, this.
how many pages is yours with that font increase?
Mine is actually a front and a back, and it's just a flip over. I'd have to go down to my bag and grab it. I should do that.
I have
see
mine,
which-
Jay. It's one side is high school NFHS rule, and the other side is MLB DH rule.
Right. And I think I know that they put something together. I have my own cheat sheet that I use. And so, but yeah, Jay, that's, I'd reach out to Jesse on that specifically. Cause yeah, I mean, having that DH cheat sheet is such a help.
Yeah, I'll do that. I'll try to have that for our meeting. Yeah, tailgaters.
Perfect. Any other questions on kind of what we were talking about? Otherwise, we can move on to the next situation. I realize this is not a simple rule. There's a lot of fine print, we'll call it. So this question basically says that in the second inning, the player DH is batted for and removed defensively. The DH is terminated, but under the normal reentry rule, he had this player may still be reentered. And so he would have to be re-entered in, like, normal re-entry rules apply. So he's got to, if he's within the 7th spot to start, he's got to go back in the 7th spot. Any questions on that? Cool. There's no exception for injury. So if the player DH is injured, you don't get to, that does not save the player DH. The player DH is still terminated. So, and then the last question here, you have a player DH, and then you do a defensive substitution for the player DH, and then you try to re-enter him. I mean, this is such a great casebook question. But basically, if you keep it simple, the player DH is in one spot in the order, or in one spot in the lineup. There's 2 different lineups. You cannot enter a substitution and then move him around because of re-entry rules. So, and like I said a couple times here, as soon as we have a offensive change to the player DH is terminated. Again, offensive substitutions terminate the player DH. The last question here, I don't know if this has ever been done, but my guess is that somebody wrote into the NFHS and was like, here's the craziest hypothetical I can think of. So, player who is a designated player DH starts as the pitcher and is replaced. They return to can they return to pitch in the fourth? Under the strict NFHS DH rule, yes, they can. It does not affect their ability to return as long as the other pitching rules are followed. A couple other casebook plays. So I guess this question is the home team can pick whatever DH they want to use. So like the home team could use a traditional straight 9, and then the visiting team could use the player DH rule, and that's perfectly legal. It's not like they have to. It's not like both teams have to use the player DH rule. So a couple substitutions. The first one is so Sanders is our player DH, and McNeely enters when he reaches the pitch count. Can Sanders stay in? Yes, because the offensive lineup has not been affected. I don't know what B was. Like I said, this is our good friend Larry's presentation that he put together. And then the last one is, can Sanders catch and still be the player DH? And the answer is yes, as long as normal reentry rules are followed.
That was my question, I guess. Should have waited.
Hey, you know what? I got no problem with you asking questions. You know our philosophy on these calls, Mike. Just ask the questions. It's better it happens here than on the field. So we have a right fielder DH, and Rodell is inserted as a defensive substitution. And so the question is simply, can the DH remain in place? And the answer is yes. Again, it's the offensive action that terminates the player DH. So this is a situation where we're going to have a player come in and hit for the player DH, which, as we know, we've now done something offensively, which terminates the player DH. Then the simple question is here is can Dolan, who is the player DH, re-enter the game on defense? And the answer is yes, as long as he is in the same spot in the batting order. So Colgate is our pitcher DH or player DH in this situation. And the player DH sprains his ankle and cannot continue and requires a pinch runner. Because we have a pinch runner that has been entered, then we're going to terminate the player DH rule. But the pitcher that was inserted for Colgate may hit. Okay. Now we got somewhere. Now we get to get somewhere that's illegal. So Federico, our player DH, is replaced due to an injury. Federico re-enters to pinch hit. And then for the player that was entered for him, that is legal. But note that the player DH is no longer in effect because we had an offensive change to the batting order. Alternatively, can Federico enter the game while McGinnis, who replaced Federico in the fourth, is still pitching? And the answer is no, because just like normal reentry, the player DH, they're locked in the same spot in the batting order. Done in under 45 minutes. It's awesome. All right. Does anybody have any questions relating to the player DH rule under NFHS? Hearing none, I will stop the recording. Next week, we're going to be discussing mentorship, I believe.